Oh, holy night, the stars are brightly shining.
It is the night of our dear Savior's birth. Bang.
Me, 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 me.
Till he appeared and the soul felt its worth.
Mint chocolate. It's technically healthy. It's got mint in it. That was good.
So, I hope you all had a very Merry Christmas. And I hope you all had a wonderful time being with family, singing carols and sharing gifts and sharing the hope of a better life that's going to be coming our way, and remembering the true essence of the holiday. So, if you were tuning in to BBC One at about 4 o'clock or so here in the UK, or if you've recently got yourself an Apple TV license for this Christmas time, chances are you were fixated on the animated adaptation of Charlie Mackesy's The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. Now, I've already done a review of the book itself in the past on this channel. It's truly a wonderful book, and in the words of Charlie Mackesy himself, this is a story for people who can be from age 8 to 80. It's just an endearing book spawned from this pure imagination of Charlie Mackesy. And to think, this book started off with him just simply doing minimalist ink drawings, well, mostly minimalist ink drawings, on Instagram. So yeah, he went from just posting some hobbies on Instagram to literally helping people in the hospital with his drawings to, well, pretty much this. And yes, I did make a video about announcing the animated adaptation of The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. And is it just me, or has the popularity of that video spiked during this month due to the implications of the animated adaptation? In case you need a reminder, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse is this very minimalist yet very endearing story about, well, fairly self-explanatory main characters, all going on this journey and giving each other some inspiration on the way. The four main characters are trying to find a home, and that's pretty much the premise of the story. Back in the year 2019, this story really hit home for so many people during the pandemic lockdown. And Charlie Mackesy has provided his illustrations as major therapy work for people in hospitals. So, understandably, a lot of people were excited when an animated adaptation was coming to BBC One and Apple TV. It was a short film that would be akin to The Snowman, and even though the story itself isn't explicitly about Christmas time, it's got a snowy aesthetic and it's a wintry aesthetic of a film, so yeah, it's obvious they were trying to make this the next Christmas classic. And in many ways, this moved people much like the book did. But on the other hand, I've read a few reviews say that this adaptation doesn't quite work as it wanted to, and I can see why people would conclude that. So how is the adaptation? Well, to assist me, I've got this Gaelic edition of The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse promoting the animated adaptation, but it's all in Scottish Gaelic, so feel free to learn how to read Gaelic if you can while I'm doing it. So I'll reveal the images to you to talk about the film itself. That way it saves me the risk of copyright. And as I'm doing so, I might as well refer to this book whenever I can, just to make certain points. So with that said, here we go. The plot is pretty self-explanatory. It's about a boy, a cake-obsessed mole, lone wolf kind of fox, and an encouraging horse, all trying to find a place called home. This whole story is pretty much like Winnie the Pooh if he held therapy sessions. That's pretty much the mood that they're going for. Right off the bat, the visuals are fine-tuned to be beautiful. It's obvious that Charlie Mackesy and all the people working on this film really cared about the aesthetics of the film, capturing the beauty of the book as well as the British countryside. And the characters themselves have this simplicity in which they seem to surprisingly capture their watercolor representatives from the original book quite well as well, even down to the ink outlines. And you can tell the filmmakers really cared about making a film that would be as visually heart-touching as much as the subject matter they were touching upon. And for the sake of the adaptation, there's a few scenes that they've added in, such as this little intro sequence of the boy being lost and then just sitting down before being introduced to the mole, who pops up to say, hello, or in the Tom Hollander voice, hello. There you go. For those who are familiar with the original book, you'll already recognize that right off the bat, certain quotations from the characters are swapped in various segments of the story. With the original book, they get straight to the point with the inspirational therapy talks, but in this film adaptation, they have a bit more of a segue as to why is the boy even there to begin with, and he says that he's lost. And also right out of the gate, we're introduced to the mole's ever-going obsession with cake. Starting off with what he thinks is a cake, but is actually a big tree in the distance of the snow and fog. And these conversations are nice to get us introduced to who these characters are and what kind of mood we're going to be in for the rest of the story. But here, some of the more nitpicky of people start to notice that the inspirational therapy talk kind of comes out of nowhere at times. And whilst I will grant the fact that in the animated adaptation, they do have some conversations, I suppose I could be in slight agreement with the fact that maybe this short film could have been a little bit longer just to make the transitions between the conversations and the inspirational quotes from the book just seem a bit more fitting and natural. I suppose that's the biggest flaw with the animated adaptation. Some of the quotes from the book itself, whilst they are brilliant by their own rights, the way they're presented in the animated adaptation might come a bit out of nowhere in terms of the writing of this film. Because these characters are on a journey, and you'd think that there could be some more nuanced conversations where they get to know each other initially, but then to pass the time, then they would have the moments to say these inspirational quotes as they're passing by on the journey. But in terms of the animated adaptation, sometimes the inspirational quotation stuff kind of just comes kind of out of nowhere, which might seem a little bit odd in regards to making an adaptation. That sort of thing could probably work better within the format of this book, because Charlie Mackesy was focusing on just these individual minimalist pictures that he put up on Instagram with these inspirational quotes to go along with the imagery he was depicting. So the way it comes across in an adaptation might be a bit odd and out of the blue. But apart from that, I can't really think of many other major flaws in regards to the animated adaptation. It's beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's well composed with its music, and the voice cast is really well cast. You've got an all-star cast with Tom Hollander as the mole. It really is really charming and friendly. Who'd have thought that Cutler Becket would be friendly and charming and obsessed with cake?
You're mad.
You got Idris Elba as the fox, which is brilliant casting if you ask me, because Idris Elba is typically associated with the sort of hardened kind of character, but I think Idris Elba works as the fox. And then you have this Irish actor as the horse. When you look at the horse, you'd think, what I find really interesting is that the horse is portrayed by an Irish actor. I think a lot of people imagine the horse as very elegant with the kind of voice that he would have. But I think the Irish voice actor gives this sort of organic country kind of feel to the horse, which really suits the horse's character, because where do you see horses most of the time? Out in the country. I mean, unless you're some rich person who rides horses in some rich person's palace, but you get the idea. This kind of horse would live out in this forest, and so it would make sense to have this sort of natural, encouraging country voice. That actually makes a lot of sense. Something I think I will give the animated adaptation credit for is that they give more of a thorough introduction to the fox, and perhaps even give him more of a distinct character arc, in the fact that when we're introduced to the fox, we see him from the predator's perspective. That is a common trope in a lot of films and television shows, where a character or characters are on their own in some spooky area, then suddenly you see some predator's perspective in a hiding place, as if ready to pounce or something like that. You get that kind of introduction to the fox. So the boy and the mole get back up to the tree, and they're greeted down below with this fox portrayed by Idris Elba, who can't quite make it up the tree, being a four-legged creature. It's more of a thorough introduction to the fox than in the original book here, because in the original book, we don't really get much of a segue. The character just shows up, and then we transition to the next scene where we're given an impression of the fox. But here in the animated adaptation, we get more of the sense of the fox being a predatory character, which makes more sense given his character arc, however brief it may be in the context of the film, just that much more nuance. And it also gives the mole that much more of a character growth as well when he rescues the fox in the next scene. We get this transition where it makes sense that the fox would hear something and then check that out instead of trying to bother climbing up the tree, only to get caught in a trap, and he gets caught in the snare. And with the previously established scene of the mole hiding with the boy in the animated adaptation, it gives a lot more stakes to this scene here where the mole rescues the fox just out of kindness. So in this scene, the boy and the mole approach the fox who's been trapped in a snare, and the mole decides independently to approach the fox. The fox says, "If it weren't for the snare, I'd kill you." Or how do I do it in the Idris Elba kind of voice? "If it weren't for the snare, I'd kill you." And then the mole says, "Well, if you stay in that snare, you'll die." So the mole approaches the wire and nibbles it off so that the fox can be free, which leads to the mole saying to the boy, "One of our greatest freedoms is how we react to things." I suppose that's a bit more of a nuanced transition to that particular inspirational quote. So, in regards to an adaptation to try to more storyfy this original story, I guess, it makes more sense to give more of a distinct arc for this sequence here and just expand it a bit. I like that. The previous scene I just mentioned also makes this scene much more justified and satisfying, as well as gorgeously animated. The boy and the mole are going down a hill, but the mole accidentally, clumsily rolls down and falls into the river. There's a brilliantly animated sequence of the mole struggling through a really well animated river, and the boy's saying, "Take my hand!" And then we see the fox coming, and then and then the boy thinks, "Oh no, the fox is going to eat the mole, or drown him and eat him." But then the fox manages to save the mole, presumably out of thanks for saving him from the trap. The boy's reaction in the animated adaptation seems a bit more genuine in this regard as well, and this is a key component in having the fox join their group, I suppose. There's more of a sequence of interactions between the fox, the boy, and the mole, between the scene I just mentioned and their encounter with the horse in the original story, but in the animated adaptation, it goes straight from what I just mentioned to meeting the horse. So yes, then they meet the horse. The horse has a more transitional encounter where they're going through the trees and then they just happen to see this horse between the trees. Whereas in the original story, the horse just kind of shows up and says, "Hello." But I suppose either way, the horse shows up to say hello. We get a sequence of the four of them having a bit of playtime together, which wasn't fully depicted in the original story, but we do get them standing on the horse's back in the original story. And we get the sequence where they're making marks on the floor, and this, in the original story, I suppose it's rather heartfelt that the fox made this heart shape in the snow as a way of saying thank you to the mole for rescuing him. I suppose in this animated adaptation, you could see the fox in the background doing it, but I think more people might get the impression that the horse was doing it, but I think it's sweeter when the fox does it, so interpret that how you will. So then we get the sequence of, oh yeah, did I mention this whole animated film is gorgeous? I like how in the animated adaptation, this whole sequence seems to be happening so fast that the filmmakers decide to slow down in still frames just to emphasize the fact that the boy has accidentally fallen off the horse, leading to the horse saying this really sweet saying, which still resonates true even in the animated adaptation, where the horse says, "You fell, but I've got you," or in the Irish accent, "You fell, but I've got you." Almost sound a bit like Liam Neeson there. "You fell, but I've got you." And this leads to the boy saying, I'm sorry, that was all my fault. But the horse says, tears fall for a reason. They are your strength, not weakness. Whoever's portraying the horse could probably do it better in his Irish accent than I could. I suppose here, a lot of adults could find some things resonating with them. They'll see some part of them in the boy himself, and they'll go through many things in life where they think, I'm sorry, it was my fault, I shouldn't have done that. But all you need is some encouragement, and you'll pick yourself back up again. In this animated adaptation, there's more of an emphasis of the boy trying to find his home, represented by a group of lights, which is obviously a town. They try to search for a river, so it's travel by the river, travel by where the people are. So the Egyptian logic goes, yes. There's this sequence here, and there's some brilliantly beautiful quotes here, such as the boy asking the horse, what's the bravest thing you've ever said? Then the horse says, help. The horse says, asking for help is not giving up. It's refusing to give up. That's a brilliant thing to say, because it's not a weakness to ask for help. It's a strength. Teamwork makes the dream work. In fact, fun fact, during the midnight service that I attended to, the minister brought up this page here as part of the sermon service, and just because it was really resonating, because none of us can do this on our own. Everybody needs help, no matter how much of a lone wolf we think we are. I mean, all of us human beings had to be born from a mother at some point. The laws of biogenesis demand that life comes from pre-existing life. Then, like in the original story, the boy points out that the fox doesn't really say much. The fox says, well, I don't think I have anything interesting to say most of the time. And the horse says, being honest is always interesting. I suppose throughout this story, it is mentioned that the boy is trying to get home, and the fox finds purpose in his 3 new friends, and the mole finds purpose in cake.
You monster.
I think it's more of an emphasis that in the animated adaptation, the boy's trying to find a home after being so lost. There's something interesting to say about the sequence of the storm sequence and the flying sequence. In the original story, it was, let's see if I remember this correctly, there's something worth noting that in the original story, the flying sequence came before the storm sequence, but I suppose in regards to pacing, it makes more sense to have the storm sequence come first before the flying sequence, because that way it gives the whole story more of a payoff, and it makes more sense in regards to story structure. Now, some might say that's kind of a predictable move, but if you ask me, I think that makes for better pacing, and it makes it for a rewarding sequence after a very hardsome and troublesome sequence. And I mean troublesome in a good way, because the storm sequence is meant to represent going through the rough parts of life. As the horse says, the storm will pass. And sure, this whole storm sequence is quite brief, but the way the boy reacts, and, well, with the mole, and how the fox and the horse provide comfort and shelter for the poor boy during this part, I think it will really resonate with a lot of people. Especially given how life isn't that easy at all. There's a point here where the fox says, look, sometimes you'll feel worthless and hopeless, but you'll pick yourself back up again, and this moved me a lot. Thank you, Idris Elba Fox. I really needed to hear that. And then, in the animated adaptation, we get the flying sequence, which makes for a more rewarding experience after the storm, which makes it arguably better paced. The horse says, I'll need to share your secret. I can actually fly, but I stopped because it made all the other horses jealous. I think some people can resonate with this, because sometimes people will have these hidden talents, but they store them away. Then we get this wonderful sequence of the horse saying he can fly, but he stopped because it made all the other horses jealous. We get this wonderful flying sequence. These flying sequences are always pretty wonderful in movies like this, especially in animated adaptations like this. I mean, the original illustrations were already gorgeous in their own right with their fairly minimalist approach. And something I probably haven't mentioned before is that the animation is absolutely gorgeously fluid. Seeing these animals move and come to life, whether it be the cute, flimsy movement, whether it be the cute, stubby movement of the mole, or the more fluid motions of, or the fluid motions of the fox and the horse, or the emotional body language of the boy. It's all wonderfully, brilliantly intricate character animation. And combine that with the watercolor aesthetic, as well as some surprisingly good CGI shots for some tracking shots, I think. It's a marvel to behold. Say what you want about this film's writing and pacing and how the messaging can come a bit out of nowhere at times, but I think this is some of the finest British animation that's come to pass in recent years. Now, I'm gonna have to admit something. Seeing this sequence on page didn't seem to be all too tear-jerking at first. I mean, couldn't the boy just invite these three animals to his home? I mean, maybe the people there could welcome them, right? But seeing it in action in the animated adaptation honestly brought me to tears. Especially when you have little moments where earlier you have, especially with early sequences where you have the mole, just like in the book, saying, "Sometimes I want to say I love you all, but I find it difficult." "Do you?" said the boy. "Yes, so I say something like, 'I'm glad we're all here.'" "Okay," said the boy. "I'm glad we are all here. We are all so glad you are here too." And then during this last part, the boy kisses the mole in the head and he says, "I'm glad we're all here." Oh my days. And then the boy concludes by the end of the story that home isn't really a place, is it? And he decides to stay back with the boy, the mole, the fox, and the horse. Now, I suppose it's important to note that with stories like this, they can only work to their full extent from an emotional standpoint. And the story is so minimal, but the way the characters were originally written by Charlie Mackesy, however implemented they may be within this adaptation, it's still meant to resonate with people and about their struggles with life. So you might logically question, well, why doesn't the boy just at least find some shelter and gather some resources from his home instead of having to try to survive out in the wild? I mean, unless he's Bear Grylls, who's also appreciated this story, by the way. So with stories like this, you may logically ponder, well, there might be some of you who might logically ponder, why doesn't the boy just go to the home occasionally and then come back to the horse, the fox, and the mole, just so he can have some warmth, some shelter, and some food and drink, instead of trying to survive in the wild out in the time? Well, unless this boy happens to be an aspiring Bear Grylls who has also admired this story, by the way. But the story, in ways, is not always meant to make logical sense. It's more about being honest, in a way. The story is The story just comes from the purity of Charlie Mackesy's imagination and talking about that, well, life is difficult, but you are loved. The story comes from Charlie Mackesy's imagination, and the overall moral of this story is that life is difficult, but you are loved. All throughout Charlie Mackesy's illustrations in this book and in this animated adaptation, Charlie Mackesy is trying to convey this one message all throughout this story, whether it be in the book or in the animated story, and it's really resonated with people because of it. Of course, he doesn't explicitly state this in every single page, but the message still resonates true, whether it be trying to get through the storms of life, or confessing your hidden talents, or appearing rough at first only to open up your heart to some new friends, or helping those who you might logically deem as your enemies, but you also know in a deeper logical sense that if you help them out, there can be the spiritual bond of selflessness. a selflessness that transcends just mere survival. You just take a look at life and you think, well, what's the point of living if it's so difficult? The answer is that you are loved. Life is difficult, but you are loved. You are loved. You're watching this at home. You're loved. Every single one of you. Even the people who are watching this video who don't like me. You're loved. And that's important to know. That's very important to know. Life would be terrible if none of us were loved. This story makes it very clear that love is what gets us through the toughest of trials. And that's something I've been learning in these recent days, especially during the aforementioned midnight service I went to. I was really struggling with overthinking in regards to beliefs and how I'm going to live out my life. But knowing that love helps to bridge the gap with a lot of things, and I don't mean an ignorant, sugar-coated kind of love. That's just the culture's definition of it. No, real love is putting yourself out of the way to help others. Real love is an ongoing relationship that only gets better and better and grows over time. At times I've questioned, well, why should I even go through these trials? And I've found out that it's to help me grow as a person. Love fulfills promises. Love helps people endure all trials and helps them grow because of it. This story is like kind of like a baptism through fire. This whole notion of baptism through fire is more explicit in more grown-up stories like The Lord of the Rings, with characters like Frodo Baggins having to bear this terrible burden of the one evil ring and having to carry this burden of pure evil. With stories such as these, such as this, the struggle can be out of this world or it can be mundane. But whatever you're struggling with, it's clear that Charlie Mackesy perfectly made the story for anybody and everybody, regardless of what age you are. It's simple enough and charming enough to reach out to even the youngest of toddlers, and yet it's also simultaneously deep and inspirational enough to reach out to even the most elderly person. So, as an animated adaptation, would I call this one of the best films of 2022? Absolutely. Would I call this the best film of 2022? Not quite. I think Top Gun Maverick and possibly Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio tops this animated adaptation, because this adaptation is quite flawed in the way that some of the inspirational quotes just come out of nowhere, and I think there could have been some more extended segues of them going on a journey so that them saying these inspirational quotes can seem a bit more natural and nuanced. So on that note, I can understand why people would probably be turned off by this animated adaptation, but honestly, that's the only major flaw I can think of. Honestly, that's the only major flaw I can think of, and if that's the only major flaw with this film, then this might be one of Britain's best animated films ever. I got a friend who's an animator from Canada who's really looking forward to seeing this, and I think he's gonna really enjoy this. And if you've missed the initial airing of this story on television, you can catch up with this story on BBC iPlayer and Apple TV. As for how I rate this movie, I think I'll give The Boy, the Mole, the Fox in the Hole... I think I'll give The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse animated adaptation a 10 out of 12. I would have called this a masterpiece, but the little flaws that I've noticed seem to hold this back. I know a lot of people probably consider this mediocre, but honestly, this is really beautiful, inspirational, moved me to tears, so I'm giving credit where credit's due. So, how did you enjoy your Christmas? Are there any harsh trials of life that you went through and yet found really resonating? That in the story it says... No, that's not making verbal sense. So, what did you find inspirational about this animated adaptation? What kind of difficulties in life are you going through, and how do you find that you're being loved? Let me know in the comments down below, and thank you for tuning into this channel to build up the hype of this animated program. I really appreciate that. One of my main goals of this channel is to raise awareness of animation as an art form and not just children's fodder, and even though this is probably not going to be the best film in 2022, I think this is major progress in showing people how animation can be an artwork. And this started from a guy just making ink doodles on Instagram. Let that sink in. Scots Myers signing out.